today I will talk about psychology of prejudice, stereotypes, discrimination, and what to do about it, which is like a very vague way how to summarize all the research that my lab and myself have been doing these few years. And I will start with just a brief presentation of my institute, because the aim of these seminars is also for you to know where you can do your research projects, where you can look for supervisors. So I can be your contact point for this particular institute at Slovak Academy of Sciences. We do interdisciplinary research, which is very convenient for Coxsci graduates. We focus on social communication and relations between groups, people and groups in society. We combine social, political psychology, cognitive, developmental, philosophy, education science, etc. So there's a wide range of disciplines and also experts from these disciplines that work together. And we are grouped in these like three big, let's say, labs or interconnected areas. One is intergroup relations, which I will talk about today. Second one is transformation of intimacy, romantic relationships, families, parenthood, etc. And the third one is literacy and its development, where we also have the Center for Pedagogical Research. What's maybe also interesting or important for you is that at this moment we have 4 former Coxscis working. So apart from me and another colleague that works in my team, we have 1 doctoral student and 1 postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Pedagogical Research team that have been studying Coxsci. All right. So today I will be talking about intergroup relations and the team that I've been working in for these few years, where we look into relations between majority, ethnic, sexual, language, and other minorities and civic engagement. And you can also follow, you can look at our website, you can follow us on social media. You will get the slides, I put the links there. And we also have institute seminars that are usually in English, so you can sometimes join if the topics are interesting for you, because they are open for public. Okay. So, my group works on intergroup relations. In contrast to interpersonal relations, this actually represents relations between different groups, such as ethnic, national, sexual, etc. So, minority-majority relations. And in this manner, also struggle for social change and social justice. What's important to understand is that from the perspective of social psychology, which is maybe the main discipline, but basically actually this field is at the intersections of social, political, and cognitive psychology, is that even though I've set some labels or some characteristics that we can divide these groups, we actually look at all social groups as some universal phenomena, basically, although there are some context-specific characteristics of, let's say, anti-Gypsyism or attitudes towards sexual minorities. From the perspective of social psychology, once we categorize us into us versus them, so in-group, out-group, there's a lot of phenomena that can be generalizable, right? So regardless of the type of group that we're talking about. What's also important to know is that we acknowledge the power dynamics in this. So basically, it's not just any arbitrary in-groups versus out-groups, but there is always a group that is majority compared to minority, advantaged compared to disadvantaged, dominant, high status compared to low status, so basically privileged versus not privileged. And this, the power dynamics plays an important role in this field. Now, in this broad field, we work on cognitive underpinnings of social categorization, of stereotyping, prejudice. Here we can also consider some personality or individual differences. We work also on social context and examining it as a fertile ground for intergroup hostility, for discrimination. So how people perceive social norms, laws, institutions, what role political discourse plays in all of this. And also what we can do about it in terms of some interventions or strategies. And we also study when do we want to do something about it. So when do people want to stand up against injustice, let's say, in terms of solidarity and allyship. And my team does also quantitative, correlational, longitudinal, experimental, presentative samples, qualitative methods, interviews, focus groups, media, political discourse analysis. So we have really a wide range of complementary, we see them as complementary methods that then together make a big picture of what we're interested in, and we also borrow from various disciplines. Now, before I start, I feel, and I always, when I engage with public or even researchers or academics from different fields that are not, let's say, social sciences, I feel that there needs to be this kind of a disclaimer because especially because of the climate that we've been in recently. And let's say also the fact, for example, that Trump administration has flagged certain areas of research as some kind of agenda, etc. So let's say that there might be this extreme thinking that it's all the agenda of some liberal ideology pushing some elite I don't know, views on the society. So just to make things clear that these fields and psychology as field in general, that's why I print screen from the American Psychological Association website, reaffirms its commitment to justice, human rights, fairness, dignity for all. These values are central to psychology. These principles, such as well-being of individuals, families, communities, organizations, are basically our ethical obligation, right, to provide decency, human welfare for everyone, and this is essential for advancement of psychology. So in this field, there is no questioning of that. And I also feel that before I continue, even though it's very sad that these type of things need to be said, but there is no such thing as biological racism, right? So there are no racial differences between groups in terms of cognitive ability, IQ, or anything, right? Also, sometimes I feel that maybe people don't know that there is scientific consensus on that, but we also need to disprove that Earth is not flat. So Earth is flat in my field. That there is also a very thin line. Basically, if you just think that, okay, maybe don't like this group, but I wouldn't harm them, right? I'm not Hitler. It's a very thin line between something we consider as harmless bias and, or not we, what somebody might consider as harmless bias, and the levels of dehumanization that leads to atrocities, think genocide, right? And even tiny occurrences of bias in everyday interactions, they accumulate, they become systematic, and they make for big differences, structural differences between groups and inequality, right? They contribute then to justifying further and to solidifying inequality. So basically, this field of research looks into, like, from this everyday, again, casual, negative experiences that do take a toll on mental health of individuals, and that's why we should care about it, but also to full-blown prejudice when people really commit, acts of very extreme discrimination, such as hate crimes, genocide, terrorism. And I would start with also, because actually the field is very young, as psychology in general is very young science, I would start also with showing how it has developed, because I think it's very interesting to show how historical events have kind of pushed certain types of questions into researchers, let's say, minds. So, this is how science works, right? You have one theory, then another theory comes that supports more data or something. So you would think that there is also this natural evolution of knowledge. But what's also interesting is that there are these historical shifts that also show how researchers react to what's happening around in the world. And this has been particularly true for this field, as we will see, because there are certain events that really kind of made certain questions salient for researchers. And, it starts with race ecology, which is up to 1920s, which is just 100 years ago, where prejudice was not a scientific issue yet. And actually, scientists were busy explaining racial differences, and they were looking into heritability and why some races are inferior, because that was the common belief. Thankfully, there have been efforts, they were disproven. So with the rise of civil rights movement in the US, there has been a dramatic reversal, and the focus then started to be onto, like, if there are really not other races that are inferior, how could we explain why some groups of people are so deprived of rights, so stigmatized, and so has so low position in the society? So this was the first time when it was redefined as problem of white, because it was the US at the time, white people's prejudice rather than other groups' inferiority, and the focus was on measuring prejudice. From there was, of course, a big influence of psychodynamic theories, and prejudice was understood as universal psychological process. For example, that there are some unconscious defense mechanisms, probably sounds familiar. There was also the explanation of, for example, the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany during the Second World War as a displacement of hostility that's generated by political humiliation and economic frustration after the First World War. So basically, they try to understand that if we agree that prejudice is unjustified, groups are not different, how can we explain why it's so pervasive? With the happenings of Second World War, let's say that way, there was a rise of trying to explain, like, who were these people who were basically committing these crimes, who were the people who were just following orders, right? And this book, The Authoritarian Personality, is one of the, like, seminal classic books in the field. It tried to explain prejudice as an outcome of certain personality structures that kind of conditioned the adoption of these prejudiced attitudes. So basically the question was, what type of personality is especially prone to prejudice given the circumstances? And it's still influential. We still use scales such as right-wing authoritarianism or social dominance orientation scales. Right-wing authoritarianism is also very interesting because it's been shown that people that are high in this trait, they conform to traditional values, conventions. They prefer to obey some kind of powerful leaders. They also don't like anybody who deviates from the group or group values in any way. And of course, derogate out groups. Their in-group identification, for example, national, is very strong, and they always perceive some type of threat, that there is some out-group, right, that is threatening us, and that's why the in-group has to stick together to be cohesive, and that's why we have to conform to norms and values, because everything that sticks out is basically a threat. Maybe it rings some bells, or maybe it's familiar with also the rise of right-wing parties. Today, it correlates with punitive parenting, social conformity, and also viewing the world as dangerous. Now, after that, there's been some criticism or some limitations of this individual differences approach, because if we consider it to be purely individual or cognitive, how can we understand why are just some societies in certain time points in history, why everybody were prejudiced, right? Why even the person who we would consider, right, normal or the good citizen would also have a black slave, for example, because it was normalized. And this is where also culture and society comes into place, and the focus of normative aspects of prejudice. So if something is normalized, if something is social norm, then everybody just conforms to it without questioning. In this way, we see prejudice as a norm that is embedded in the social environment. And the question here is then how these norms influence and determine individual attitudes in terms of also socialization within the family and conformity to traditional norms. And then with the cognitive revolution in psychology, which you are all aware of, and I don't have to explain, hopefully, we also see, or we also started to examine what makes prejudice such a universal social phenomena. What happened is that even though the norms have changed, right, the explicit racism has declined, or let's say explicit attitudes. Often you ask somebody whether you're racist. At the time, it has declined. But what hasn't declined were these more subtle or complex expressions. And here we speak about old-fashioned versus modern racism, or implicit versus explicit prejudice, also aversive racism, subtle. It has a lot of names or terminology in the field. And there was also a big focus on how to measure these type of how to measure our bias even when we want to control it, right? If we want to control and show that we are not biased, how to still kind of get to it. There are very innovative methods such as implicit association test, which you can actually also take online, which actually measures your reaction time. So it's not something you can really control. So basically, with this cognitive revolution, prejudice was seen as a cognitive bias. Maybe you already heard of heuristics, biases. They basically organize our world, in this case, social world, because we don't have the capacity to basically give each individual the attention as it's a novel stimuli, right? We would really burn out from that. So basically, we make shortcuts, we make these boxes, heuristics, and we divide people into groups so we can easily move on, just as we do with apple and tomato. Prejudice was also seen as an outcome of this social categorization process, or basically, if you want to go a step back, in a more abstract level of mental representations. And here I also want to put a disclaimer, is that this type of approach, even though it's still quite dominant, and there's, of course, a lot of evidence to support it, there's also this problematic of normalizing it. If we just embrace it like, oh, okay, so we're all, that's our brains, we're biased, we can just move on. It's important to understand that even though, yes, there are heuristics, we should be aware of them, but prejudice becomes discrimination when it's coupled with power. So if you're a person in position of power, like a teacher or a landlord, renting a flat to somebody, or an employer looking at resumes, that is when you're in a position of power, and that's when you act on your prejudice, it becomes discrimination, right? So members that have the power, they also have the resources to act upon these negative attitudes and undermine the opportunities of other groups. So even though there's certain part of bias that might be natural, there are also evolutionary explanations. So even though we can say that, okay, some part of it might be natural or biological, or however we frame it, it's important to understand that acting upon it shouldn't be, right? And that also this in-group bias shouldn't lead also to hate, to atrocities, even though it very often does. But there are also conditions when it does so. Now, and just to show also how arbitrary social categorization can be, can you tell me which of the two paintings would you prefer? Which one do you like the more? Who likes more the red one? Clee. Okay. Not half, but almost. So I would assume that the rest prefers the other painting. So now if I would sort you into these two groups based on this painting, and I would give you some task to, for example, divide points between yourselves, you would most likely prefer your own group and give your own group more points, even though it's really very arbitrary criteria that made this group belonging. And this is the outcome of very famous paradigm and still very dominant approach in social psychology, social identity theory. Basically, Tashfel and Turner, very important researchers, they had the goal to find minimal conditions when would people feel like us versus them. Obviously, we know it's, when we have nations or sports or some clubs, we know that this happens, but they wanted to see what is the lowest point where people can group into belonging into some cohesive unit. And they didn't have to go far, because they found that actually it's enough just the most arbitrary thing, like these two paintings, or tossing a coin, or whether you get a red pen and the other group gets a blue pen. So basically, even the slightest division into us versus them triggers this type of mechanisms where you favor your own in-group at the expense of the out-group. And not sure how much you can see from me, but basically these numbers, in-group, out-group, it's a part of it's a series of experiments, so it's been replicated many times, is basically how they how participants were supposed to divide points between themselves and the other group. And you can see lots of combinations, like 7 and 1, it maximizes differentiation, like we get 7, they get just 1. We also have 13 and 13, which is fair, right? We have 19 and 25, which is everybody gets the most they can get. What is funny that maybe rational choice would be 19 and 25 because I get the most regardless of the other group. People would not choose it that often. People would choose to kind of maximize the difference between us versus them. So it came even at the expense of my own kind of, well, it could maybe even be income. I think there were also some experiments where it was the income they got from the experiment. So it was really at my expense that I tried to favor my own group over the other. And they termed this as minimal group paradigm. So basically, as minimal conditions for this group perception to get elicited. So the mere perception of two groups is sufficient to trigger discrimination or favoring the in-group. Developments of that further theory found that actually this self is not fixed. What group we belong to or how we perceive these boundaries. That's why I really like this this other picture where it's painting the boundaries because it can happen anywhere, right? So we can paint the boundary here, like Geek and me are teachers, you are the students. We can paint it into women and men, or I don't know, based on our with what cheesecake we like, or really different types of characterizations of us or labels. And which of these divisions happen also depends on what is present in our minds in terms of what is salient in our context, what is activated or has been activated recently, etc. So actually what our environment also kind of provides these affordances on how or which lines we draw or how we perceive each other, which I will get to later, for example, political discourse, right? Those terrible migrants. So what's also interesting is that this categorization has all kinds of then manifestation or resulting phenomena. One is, for example, this perceived variability within our group and between groups. So we perceive that within in-group, our group and the other group, we are all the same, but basically we like to maximize differences between group, like they're completely different from us, but they are also the same. So basically the out-group heterogeneity effect also says that we tend to see less variability, and that's why we tend to box them all together, right, into one big bad group of people, because we cannot kind of cognitively perceive that they also have variability like our own group, that not everybody are the same. So this group categorization has also been examined as a tool for prejudice reduction strategy. And one of them is the way we can reappraise what is in-group, out-group as a result of intergroup contact. Intergroup contact is also one of the most or biggest or most supported theories with a lot of evidence, a lot of meta-analytic findings showing that when you put people from different groups together, they can talk, cooperate, etc. There are some certain conditions that need to happen. It has to be positive, pleasant, etc. Then they actually reduce prejudice towards the other group. So basically, it's just enough for us to meet this terrible migrant, sit and talk to them, see that they're also a person, and it will all be good. And there's a lot of work on how, so making people interact, basically how it reduces prejudice on both sides. It's not always possible, right, to put all these people together, but that's why we're also working with strategies that are not direct. There's like indirect contact. So for example, knowing that, let's say I'm a homophobic person, but knowing that my good friend has a friend who is, let's say, gay, or automatically makes me kind of include this other person in myself or social category because of the friendship, and therefore I can kind of reduce my own prejudice towards the whole group. Basically, when we have kind of this bigger inclusiveness of our own group, so the more we think of these big superordinate categories, the biggest of them being, for example, all humanity, right? The more than the mechanisms that will be triggered that are valid for our own group are then actually triggered also for other groups belonging to our subordinate category. And as you can see also in the picture, so basically us and them, with the wall, but if we recategorize these thinking into we, then it should all be good, right? And this way we kind of humanize also these outgroup members. We have less distance towards them, and we can have more complex identity. There's also been an approach on social identity complexity. So basically your own subjective perception of the groups that you belong to, like how many you have them, how complex and different from each other they are, that then makes you aware of complexity overall, and that other people can have also complex social identities. So it's not just some terrible migrant, but it's also a musician, for example. And then it also helps humanize, right, the other. And yeah, there's been a lot of work on this. Here I just put some screenshots on some of the papers from our lab, although it's been a few years back and we kind of moved on from this research, but we've also been part of a big project that was examining even the interventions that reduce prejudice towards the Roma in Slovakia, like overall at the level of state or NGOs. And we were looking into how this works in the field, or what mistakes from a theoretical perspective they might be doing. A lot of it has been focused on anti-Gypsyism, which I will also come to later. Then we also look into cognitive predictors or effects. I put slash because sometimes you cannot, it's hard to determine what is the cause, what is the effect. Sometimes basically people that already come into your experiment that are more open-minded. Sometimes with intergroup contact, they become more open-minded. Sometimes it's more open-minded people who seek intergroup contact that makes them more, so it's like a circle. But basically, there's been, it's also called a liberalization of contact, liberalization effect. So basically that there's a secondary effect of contact when you meet people from other groups, you do go study abroad and things like that. You also kind of become more open-minded, flexible, and this also has this secondary effect on how you view other groups, diversity in general, for example. And there's been a lot of work on cognitive styles and motivated cognition approach. So there's been some efforts to show that certain types of people are more open-minded, creative, flexible on different scales or tasks, and that there is a difference between people who have this high need for cognitive closure, who are very intolerant to ambiguity and uncertainty. It's also been criticized for being a lot of self-report. So once you put it to test into terms of some tasks, cognitive tasks that people do, it's not so straightforward, but it's still an interesting approach. And here I also put some some outcomes that have been shown. So also problem solving, flexible thinking. I'm working with a colleague that works on metacognition. So we're also looking into how people who are have higher metacognitive skills, which is kind of regulation of your own thinking, how they also actually have a lower prejudice. And I put two papers that are not out yet, but hopefully will be soon, that are in this stream of cognitive predictors of effect. But yes, now I want to show you also that it's not so straightforward, and that even though we can, understand what happens in the head of that one individual, and why this individual hates other groups, right? And even if you try to change the mind of this one individual, it's still not as simple and straightforward for achieving social justice, for achieving equality. So let's say that we have a group of these red people who hate the other group of these colorful people. And let's say we do some, efforts to reduce prejudice, which would mean, for example, putting them into contact, having them, bake cookies together and have fun and understand that they're all humans and they like each other. And we make better attitudes from both sides. We achieve harmony. They like each other, right? There's been now criticism that actually doesn't end there. And why do we know this? Is because we've seen a lot of progress for equality in Western societies. And then we've seen also a new backlash of, like, wait, if we do pretend we're all colorblind and everything is well, it's still not well, because there are still some systematic differences between us. And actually, when we make this group like each other, then also the disadvantaged groups, because they like each other, like the other group, they expect fair treatment, and they expect everything is well. They don't expect discrimination, and they also don't have any willingness to fight further for their own justice. And this has been the basis of this like a newer stream of research that's based on criticism of mainstream prejudice research and this entire prejudice reduction approach. So basically that even if we pretend to have achieved harmony, it doesn't mean that social justice is achieved, and we kind of basically just sedate the both groups not to do anything about it. The criticism has also been, and this is especially for the cognitive approach, that there is a focus on individualism, on how it's all just irrational thinking, information processing, which normalizes it. As I said, there is also the fact that it kind of this view obscures the role that race is embedded in historical, cultural contexts, right? And that there is power relations, right? That it's not all simple as that in terms of social categorization, but some groups have always been in power, whereas others haven't. And of course that what happens in the lab is not always equal to what happens in natural settings. And basically now they're considered as like two approaches that, yes, we or some people do try to reconcile them, but basically that the prejudice reduction approach, it focuses on psychological orientations towards outgroup members. So these, as I've said, like cognitions, emotions, attitudes towards them. Whereas on the other hand, we have collective action research, which is actually mostly, it used to be from sociology, which examines the orientation towards the social system, to what extent it's fair, just, or frustrating. Because what happens is also that, although I don't have space to talk about it, but also this categorization is not all into prejudice and non-prejudice. We can also have stereotypes based on incompetence, or we can have paternalistic attitudes, which is, for example, very common in benevolent sexism. So it doesn't mean that men hate women, but they just think they're very fragile beings that should be put on a pedestal and very special, right? It's also not basically good for equality. So, yes, so although both are kind of psychological analysis, one starts in the head of the person and then goes out to consider how interpersonal reactions, individual acts of discrimination work, whereas the other begins kind of top-down from broad social inequality and then ventures back into the head of the person to consider what we would do about it. Because actually when it happens, even though we have a lot of people who are claiming they're not racist, they wouldn't actually do anything about the fact that we are not all equal. And yes, I put a picture also of the Black Lives Matter because it's also been an example how apparent equality was actually made inapparent. And when we see that actually if you're a black person in the US, even though we pretend it's equality and colorblindness, you're still more likely to end up in prison, right? So this is exactly the small biases that accumulate and make for systematic differences, even though it's not as bad as it was, right? So, which brings me to political discourse. These are my favorite photos I used on that. It's also been known as the Trump effect. Here, this is in Slovak, but basically a very interesting, it was a couple years back. So there was a far-right MP who said something very derogatory about the Roma in a radio show in Slovakia. And he basically said that something basically biological racism. I forgot what were the words, and he was actually convicted because it's against the law to do this. However, our Prime Minister and Prime Minister at that time, Robert Fico, he said that this guy just said what everybody thinks, and what you're now going to put into jail, but something that everybody just says right in the bar next door. So basically, this is the way how political discourse normalizes prejudice. And we also see Stop Migrants and the famous Zikal of Elon Musk. So what happens is that the field thought, kind of in a naive way that we're all just going to progress, that it's linear, straightforward. And the whole work has been focused on the fact that blatant racism does not exist anymore because it's also very dominated by the West, right? This also happens in science. that perspectives of other countries are not so interesting or important as Western countries. And basically there's been this understanding that there is pressure of egalitarian norms. It's not okay to be racist. So that's why people are not openly racist anymore. If some are, then it's like this unconscious bias that we still have to work on correcting. This has also been because there's really been a decrease in explicit reporting of prejudice. And as I've said also before, the field has focused on how to still map it even when participants control it, right? But we know that in many other places in the world, even Slovakia, old-fashioned racism has never left the stage. And actually in Slovakia, it's always kind of been okay to be racist against the Roma, for example. And we also see now that, and this is interesting because just in the very short career of mine, we've seen this shift in norms also in the West. So now suddenly it's not so bad to be racist, even in the US, right? So it's very funny that when we would present this research from this different context, it was still considered as something, very deviant from the norm. But now actually these researchers are back and begging us like, okay, what do you know from your context? Because it's happening there as well. It's also known as a Trump effect. So there are studies that are analyzing how differences in perceived acceptability of prejudice, perceived social norms, how they give rise to basically expressions of prejudice in like large-scale representative samples. And basically what it does, it normalizes it. Here I put also two papers of mine because I've focused specifically on adolescents. And this is interesting because adolescents, they are very sensitive to social norms. They are still finding themselves. Their attitudes are crystallizing. So this is when they are kind of very receptive to normative environment. And we were also examining how adolescents' perceptions of whether there's some kind of norm against prejudice or norm that you should not be racist, how it might relate to their own expressions of prejudice in Slovakia. Yes, I also like this Trump quote, "These aren't people, these are animals." This is very, very nice textbook approach of example of dehumanization. So when you're considering some group to be less than human. I think this was when he was talking about how immigrants also eat cats or something like that. So what we also study and what we know is that the way authorities, so people in power or our social reference or people that basically have influence over what big groups of people think, political leaders are a big, are like this best example of that, but we can also go at a lower scale of high school and who are the popular kids, right? So it's the reference in social groups. So how they may influence this normative context, how they carry information about deservingness, about moral considerations about other people. And we've looked into also, for example, how institutionalized racism during the COVID was actually normalized. So which discursive, and this is the analysis of language, right? So which discursive strategies are used to legitimize or justify the treatment of these groups. And we're working also on the discourse on LGBTQ rights after the terrorist attack, which you probably know has happened a few years back. So why it's important to also look into this social context, because even though it's all in our heads, our perceptions of these social contexts have consequences. And there's also one research I like to use a lot, is that, so there was a researcher in Hungary who showed that she examined at the very beginning of the school year the attitudes of I don't know, high schoolers, not sure which grade they were. And she also asked them what they think the rest of the people think. First of all, they were not very accurate in their perceptions. They thought that everybody's more racist than themselves. What's interesting is that by the end of the school year, everybody corrected their own attitude to the misperceived group norm. So everybody just became more racist because they were thinking the other people were more racist than themselves. So it's a very nice way how these mechanisms work. Yes, I've mentioned threat a lot. It's actually also a variable that's very strong, correlates a lot, or is very, significant in any study we do. The highest numbers we get for feelings of threat, so threat from them, and this is something that's used very much in political discourse, right? And this is something we will be also looking in now in the future. So, and something that's also more cognitive. So these zero-sum beliefs, thinking all or nothing, cognitive representations, so that if some group gains something, my group automatically loses, like advantage, right? Now there's lots of talks about how white male is disadvantaged in the society because all these other groups are gaining advantage. So these are, of course, promoted by discourses, political discourses that elicit perceptions of threat. Of course, why we are in such state we are is because all of these processes are more pronounced during societal crisis, so economic, pandemic, wars, we have everything nowadays. That makes the perfect fertile ground for all the processes I've been talking about. Conspiracy beliefs are also very much, or affective polarization are very much influential because if we find our bubble that thinks this way and provides some clear boundaries of how the world works, it really helps us for our social identity needs to belong. It provides certainty if we are in the world full of uncertainty, right? Yeah, we worked a lot also on anti-Gypsyism because we are fascinated how very specific it is compared to other types of we call it group-based enmity, but basically other types of prejudice to other groups. Also very interesting to see how actually this is a representative sample. So majority people in Slovakia do agree that most Slovaks have negative attitudes towards Roma. Most Slovaks think Roma have negative characteristics, for example, thieves, aggressive. Most Slovak people do not like Roma minorities. So there is very big consensus that, yes, people in Slovakia do not like the Roma. We call this a social norm. We also see how people's own attitudes are. And this is self-report. So this is just very basic item, like I think Roma people are lazy. They're born lazy. And 80% of representative sample population said yes to this. So these prejudices are not hidden. So we've also been focusing on anti-Gypsyism as very unique case of racism that's never been kind of condemned by the majority. So basically, and we also moved into researching not just prejudice, but also solidarity. So when do we want to help us versus them, or when do we make it into us versus them when it comes to solidarity? This has been really pronounced, and we're talking now about that double standards when the war broke out in Ukraine and we suddenly had a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and it was wonderful how so many societies and so many people willingly and readily wanted to help them. Laws were created very quickly for them to integrate into the labor market, all kinds of fantastic how speedy society can react. But it's also kind of, put shadow to all refugees from Middle East that's been, that had very different circumstances for years. So there's also talk of double standards or selective solidarity, and we're looking into what makes some groups just, be given this preferential treatment. Of course, there's similarity, right? Ukrainians are more similar to Europeans. There's no religion issues, no less threat, etc. But there are also processes that make us create these boundaries, right? And we also look into the whole spectrum. So sometimes we're just indifferent towards the suffering of others. Sometimes we dehumanize them, discriminate them. And sometimes we do perceive that they have a common or shared identity of our own group, which then encourages acts of allyship and solidarity. But it's also very often, and this is what we see when we talk to people in interviews, focus groups, it's presented as conditional to their contribution to the society. And there are these certain deservingness criteria that make people more deserving of our help or not. And I've put also some newer papers on this topic here. I didn't manage to link them yet, but when I send you the PDF, they will be linked. And finally, I don't know what time it's, okay, I'm still good with time. So finally, I also want to show you that we are looking into different side, the perspective of the minority groups. It's also very interesting how not all of these mechanisms work the same when it comes to the group that has been disadvantaged or has been underprivileged in the society. And here we also looked at from the perspective of this criticism that if there's harmony, if there's good positive contact between groups, then it might actually decrease minority members' mobilization for social change. So they wouldn't really be into standing up for themselves as the whole group. Because research has shown that it can decrease perceptions of injustice, increase perceptions that actually, and this is interesting, this is typical meritocracy, that these group differences are legitimate, that they are really better than us, and this is our good position in the society because we don't deserve more. And which can really be, this can be really shown on so many levels, even just women compared to men, women academics, or academics from underrepresented countries such as Slovakia compared to academics from Western country, or actually, and there's a new paper out that we also collaborated as we collected data for Slovakia that's looked into all non-Western countries and stereotypes about Western countries or Western Europeans particularly. And it's been shown that systematically, actually, people from non-Western European countries think of Western Europeans as simply more competent. And this is very nice system justification. It's also system justification theory, how we see inequality, we see differences in power, and we internalize it as, yes, this is how things should be because we are inferior. We were looking into this in Roma minority. I will show you results of representative Roma sample. It's still small, but it was used with the agency to map all types of Roma people, so also with low education, also from settlements, but also integrated. And we also are doing interviews and focus groups with Roma people to understand how they perceive this. And yes, this is interesting that it's part of this criticism for prejudice reduction approach. So that basically, if you're disadvantaged, you have several ways how to cope with it. Some are individual, some are collective. So you can fight for yourself and for your own climbing the social ladder. You can try to assimilate with the dominant group, and you can try to be more like them and to just belong more into the higher group society. And this is considered as an individual response to disadvantage in terms of social mobility, so improving one's own position, which also kind of means this distancing from the disadvantaged group and disidentification from the low status group, that because we know also from social identity theory that nobody likes to be part of a group that's disadvantaged. It's not good for our basically well-being. This strategy might be or was considered theoretically as contributing to status quo, because if everybody thinks this way, they also, when they, with meritocracy, when they make it in the society, they also think like, oh, I made it, I crossed so many barriers, why are they lazy? They should do the same. On the other hand, and this was considered mutually exclusive, is this collective action approach where I'm angry at the system. I understand that it's not easy for everybody to fight so much, to overcome so many barriers, and I, mobilize to do something for the benefit of the whole group. And when we say collective action, we really mean like these big movements. Of course, it can be smaller level, like petition in your village for ending segregation in school, but it can also be this big worldwide movement like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and the big movements. So they were considered as mutually exclusive. And when we think of this positive contact as promoting common in-group identity, then it can also promote actually more this social mobility approach to disadvantage at the expense of thinking at the group level, right? So we've examined this in the Roma minority, and this is the only type of data I'm showing because I want to show you, the whole range of stuff what we do. But this is, it's called structural equation modeling. So we have some variables. These are still relationships between variables, but structural model, it assumes causality, the path of causality. And here we've seen that actually, on the contrary to all these criticisms and theoretical approaches. And this is what I like about doing research in Slovakia, is that we take these big Western theories, we apply them, they don't work, and then it's great to write a paper of like, it doesn't work here. So we see here that actually the more Roma people had contact with just the majority Slovak population, the more they would be willing to actually stand up. We put collective action, but it was actually made a cause of like standing up for segregation in schools, because this is a very important and very prominent issue when it comes to Roma in Slovakia, that schools are segregated. So kids go to specialized classes where they just don't have the same education. And then we also see that, positive contact did increase feeling of the common group, so a feeling of I'm also Slovak, right? I belong into this national group. And this did promote the social mobility strategy of standing up for ourselves and moving up the social ladder. But they were not mutually exclusive, these two approaches. You can see the very high correlation, 55 is like moderately strong correlation between them. So also people who would try to kind of make it on their own would also stand up for the whole group, because it shows that maybe when you have contact with the majority, when you make it on your own, you also kind of have resources to act on the behalf of the whole group. And if you're, still thinking what to eat tomorrow, it's not really a good time to sign petitions and go to protests, right? So just one example how you can theorize nicely, but when you go into the field, it doesn't work that way. And we also do focus groups with them. It's very interesting how they also navigate between these internal, external attributions to injustice. So basically how they also blame their own group, like, yes, they don't want to work, they're lazy, and how they also acknowledge the structural discrimination. So that's also very interesting to see in the minority groups themselves. Okay, I've been talking a lot, but what's important for you also, if you want to engage with our work, what are our next steps? We will continue focusing not only on the majority, but also disadvantaged groups themselves. We're working also in Ukrainian samples now, interminority solidarity, so how one disadvantaged group actually would like to act on the behalf of other, or this like coalition on fighting for just group rights in general. Here it's very interesting, and also we will meet her probably later, but we have a former Coxsai who's working on Russian minority and how their identification processes work for them to stand up against the regime in Russia and resistance, or helping Ukrainian refugees, etc. Then we will continue to focus on dynamic social norms and identities, how they shift, how they shape our perception, how the role of perceptions of social norms change. I also submitted, we will start from January, a project on democratic backlash. So how these perceptions of dynamic norms, or this like fear of cultural shift, might explain right-wing attitudes, prejudice, etc., zero-sum beliefs. So this perception that there are certain groups in society that in the future will start gaining more and more disadvantage, and this makes the majority group feel very threatened because it's a sensitivity to privilege loss. So we will be also looking into this and identity fragility. And we are also working on such, it's called psychological reactance to normative pressure. So this feeling that this backlash against the politically correct terms, right? Or that something is pushed on you, so you want to act out against it. So it's called reactance. And this motivation to regain freedom after it's been lost or threatened. So we are looking also into the role of this, how it has some kind of repercussions of how people perceive their own inclusion in the public discussion, and societal issues in general. Thank you. I will stop talking, and if there's anything that's, because I've shown a variety of things, if there's anything that you are particularly interested in, we can discuss that in more detail. Or if you have any thoughts, lingering thoughts, or anything that I've said, let me know.
Thank you very much.